You're listening to Culture 360, the podcast that takes you inside the world of workplace and team culture. I'm Stu Savage, your host and guide, as we explore the ideas, people, and stories shaping the way we work, lead, and connect. So please subscribe, sit back, relax, and enjoy culture from every angle. Hello, good people, and welcome to the Culture 360 podcast once again. And for part 2 of our education series, Belonging by Design, I'm your host and guide, Stu Savage. And the second episode today focuses on belonging by design and how schools create cultures where every child can succeed, building on our first part. And if you haven't checked that out, The School Wasn't Built for Me, then please go and check that out. It's a riveting listen with Jamie Gillespie and Duncan Morrison. So once again, we've got our seasoned veteran of podcasting, education aficionado and assistant head teacher from Bridgewater High School in Warrington in the UK, Duncan Morrison. I believe you're fresh from a holiday in the Lake District, Duncan. Now, that means one or two things. You've either been having a beer next to Lake Windermere or you've been scaling Scarfell Pike. Which one was it?
It was Kendall Mint Cake in the bed and breakfast bar. Walk up Winfell and Winlatter Pass, Stu.
Sounds very sophisticated, mate.
Yeah, you know me, Stu.
I'd also like to welcome a special guest for part 2, James Nelson. Listeners will remember James from episode 4, Going Underground. And I did go back and check. It wasn't about the Jam and that great song that they did. It's more about primary emotions in the workplace. And we touched a number of topics, psychological safety and clinical psychology and a whole host of other things. James has got an extensive background in counselling and therapy, with some of his journey focusing on secondary school students in the UK and New Zealand. James, welcome. I believe we're cutting into your busy working day in the clinic, so we really appreciate you taking time out. How are you?
Thanks, Yep, good, mate. Good to be here.
I'm not sure if you've had a chance to listen to the first episode, which went live yesterday. What we're trying to do with this series is to focus on belonging in education, as we've discussed. And the key question really on the notes here is if belonging doesn't happen naturally for every young person, how do schools intentionally design it into culture, relationships, routines, and everyday experiences? That first episode we did, Duncan, we explored the idea that some young people experience school as a place that wasn't really built for them, in quotes. And we're not talking about the physical building. We're talking more about the rules, routines, and the language and expectations don't always match their lived experience. Just dovetailing with that first episode, if we accept that belonging matters, what does the school actually have to do differently to create intentionally rather than simply hoping it happens? I mean, what are your thoughts there and reflecting back onto that first episode and bringing it into this second one? As a senior leader at your school, how can you intentionally design this environment?
Well, that's a big question, I suppose. I think linking into the experience that James is going to obviously explore. Well, I'm hoping he will from his background. It's things like you mentioned a couple of moments ago about it's building that psychological safety into schools. So when a child walks through the school gates, I think, when we're talking about belonging and what it means, it's trying to answer those questions or put to bed those fears that children or anyone has who accesses an organisation. I suppose it's, am I safe here? Am I known here? And do I matter here? I think they're the three things that, when I seen your big question, as it were, Stu, that you sent to us last week regarding today's debate, I thought that any school culture that's designed intentionally needs to answer those three questions. So safety, being known, and mattering were the three things I thought it would need to address. I don't know what James's view would be on that.
Yeah, it is, as you said, Duncan, it's a huge question. You could spend the whole podcast on this one question. When I looked at this, the first word that came to me was one which you've used, which was safety. What I hear from kids who have been I'm currently doing some consulting in an alternative education centre where kids haven't made it in mainstream, and that type of kid often reports not feeling safe. And you've got the whole school grounds and the whole school culture, but also what kids often report to me is that each classroom is different. You know, there's despite school policy and generic school rules, teachers are humans, and some of them have incredibly differing expectations, which sometimes aren't crystal clear from the go. And young people can then feel sort of sideswiped by that. But, you know, trust and safety are the two words that immediately came to me when I started to think about this question for sure. Yeah, I mean, my view is, and certainly what kids tell me, is that if they don't feel safe, they won't learn. They just won't be present. They will check out literally and fall through the cracks.
Yeah, James, you know, we see, I mean, it's interesting that you talk about an alternative provision. You know, those children that are the hardest to reach are those children that you're talking about in alternative provisions. And those are the children who need the adults in schools to stand up for them and be their advocates. And often they're the children that nobody wants to be with or, you know, find it difficult to connect with. It's really interesting that you should say that. But yeah, you know, that mental truancy, that being in the building but not being in the building is something I'm really interested in regards to mobile phones as well. You know, that the sort of lack, you know, the lack of safety that mobile phones provide for children, you know, that little buzz in the pocket whilst they're in your lesson, even though the phone's not out, it makes them mentally truant that lesson.
Yes.
And that's all linked, but I'm going off tangent again there. Sorry, Stu.
No, this is gold. James, have you seen over obviously a couple of decades that you've been in and around counselling secondary school space that social media has had some impact, as Duncan alluded to?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was thinking about this very thing driving in this morning. I mean, remembering in the dim, distant days when I was a teenager, I remember like deferred gratification is not the middle name of most teenagers. You know, we were all out back in my day when I was a teenager in the 70s, going back decades. We all wanted instant thrills, something now. But my view is that social media has kind of, in many ways, harmfully increased that, but by more than tenfold. And I know that some schools at this side of the world are trying to sort of instigate rules where kids hand phones in. And I kind of support that, but kids have more than one phone. You know, I personally spoke to a kid yesterday who handed in a phone, but their chief phone was kept in the pocket. You know, kids can text in their pockets, and understandably, teachers they just can't pick all that up. And watches currently smartwatches haven't been banned yet, so kids are able to communicate via a watch on social media without even looking at the replies. So that's a worry. I'm not quite sure how we're going to get around that. You know, we can't strip search, obviously, but it is a worry. I think the more that we can keep that out of our education systems, the better. An alternative view, I guess, would be kids whose only connections come via social media. You know, so it's a fine line, isn't it? We're walking here.
We've obviously seen in this country, in New Zealand, that the government are now trying to put a ban on social media for kids up to 16. And I think they've already done that in Australia. Is that the same in the UK, Dunk?
Yeah, so for under 16s, it's sort of we're playing a bit of catch up with the Aussies, but yeah, a very similar systems going into place here. Yeah, so that's something that's in the pipeline for us as a school in September. So in a couple of weeks' time, when we return for the next academic session, we've adopted school pouches, phone pouches, sorry, which are those magnetic pouches that the phones go into. And we're going to wand every child with like an airport style security system as they come in. We've got 1,700 kids in school, so we're going to need in excess of 20 members of staff to man the school gate. But without getting into the mobile phone side, because I think that's another podcast altogether, Stu, what I would say is, when we talk about, safety and psychological safety, imagine being 11, walking through a school gate and having to be wanded by 20 adults you don't know every morning just to get in the building. And what we're sort of saying, Stu, is, your question was, how do we design it in? What I think we need to be saying in schools is, we're glad you're here. We expect great things from you. We want you to succeed, which answers those three questions about safety, being known and mattering. But then the first thing they're going to do is they're going to come in the gate and be wandered and have the phones taken off them. However, in our research with our children told us that they'd never say it in front of the peers, but they were actually looking forward to not having the pressure of having the phones on them.
That's interesting.
Yeah, but these are mainstream kids, James. But lots of Well, look, I'm anticipating there being a lot less people go in the toilet as well. Certainly around when the Champions League fixtures come out in September.
I guess from your perspective, Duncan, the operational side of having to manage that, and you've covered a couple of things there about, being wanded as you walk into the school could cause a bit of a disconnect. But how much of a distraction for staff is that when you're trying to build this environment to manage that side of things on top of teaching and having been a teacher, you kind of have several hats that you need to consider. How do you manage that with staff?
Yeah, so I mean, coming back to the question, Stu, about this designing it into your systems, the biggest problem with teaching is teacher workload. So on top of planning, marking, duties, actually delivering sessions, whereas we as a school currently now, our principal is trying to build in time through our CPD model and sort of in some of their directed time for staff is to use that time to build, natural relationships. But then, wandering kids as they come into school is just another job, isn't it? Which sits on top of an already busy workload for teachers. So, it's that balancing act, isn't it, between operationally running the school and delivering on strategic sort of goals like belonging, which is one of our goals, and our principal's keen on us developing that side of the school. But you're right, it's where do teachers get the time to build those relationships? Because, every time we've spoken over the last couple of podcasts, we always come back to the R word.
Yeah, we do. And I think we've had that little anecdote where you sat next to somebody on the plane and it being quite awkward at first, and it is, quite difficult at first to build these relationships, build these connections. And something I was thinking about coming into the podcast today when I'm driving my daughter into school was, like I've said before, having been a teacher, you've got the workload aspect. I'm wearing several other hats, but also I think it's just fair to say, like, both on the student and staff side, people aren't always great at making relationships. We assume that, because you're a teacher, you're great at forging relationships, but I don't think that's always the case, is it, Dunk?
No, I've got to be careful what I say here in print. But what I would say is that, look, lots of people get into teaching for lots of different reasons. The vast majority of those people get into teaching because they want to see young people succeed. The difficult side to it is, not everybody is as gifted as others when it comes to, being people. I would argue that us three sat here, in different time zones are probably fairly skilled at, managing people and operating at different levels. And, but as a teacher, if I was to take a subject such as, I don't know, geography or physics, you you're expected to be an expert in physics, but you're also expected to be an expert in people as well. And, sometimes those things are never going to fall in that way, but I think it also depends on what are we actually talking about here in a school of 1,700 children like mine. I would say there's probably 15 children across the whole of the school who would be really difficult to connect with. But then James has talked about his work in an AP, an alternative provision, where every one of those children will have that need, and that's a different ball game altogether. But then you wouldn't go and work in an AP if you weren't a relation specialist, because you just wouldn't last. What do you think, James?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Even with the huge privilege of being able to talk privately with young people on a one-on-one situation, kids who have been excluded from school, kicked out forever before the age of, but sometimes before the age that they legally should have been, going into a meeting like that with a young person and possibly with members of their family, they're bouncing off the walls before they even get into the room. Why should they trust me? So it's a real challenge. On the other hand, it is incredibly fulfilling or satisfying in a way when kids do start to trust and realize they're being listened to, and that they're able to genuinely air their feelings about school and teachers that they've fallen foul of and teachers that they've also trusted. But that doesn't come quickly. Even though I've been, a counsellor for many years, I often tell myself, before a packed day, just be ready for a series of encounters. You might not win them all, and that does happen. You can be absolutely brilliant at forming relationships, but if a kid's not ready, you're not going to get anywhere. And I distinctly remember that from when I was a classroom teacher many years ago, working very hard to sort of get most of the kids on board. That there were possibly always one or two in a lot of lessons who you just couldn't, almost like the army describes, like a shock of capture. You just couldn't quite get them. But it's just one of the joys of connecting professions when that does happen. It's very, very fulfilling, and seeing kids kind of relax when they know that you've got their backs. Yeah.
Interesting what you're saying there. So it's I always think, I deal with the children, I give them to people like you. Do you know what I mean? So I take them from the mainstream and manage them into alternative provisions because they're rightly the right provision, because certain students can never access mainstream. And I always think that, and there's no theory behind this. This is just, 20 odd years in teaching, people who have sort of more traditional, I've got to try and say this without being derogatory, more traditionally, who can access traditional school in a more linear way, right? So it's like one step after the other after the other. That's the vast majority of mainstream. The word I would use is linear. So, year 7, year 8, year 9, year 10, year 11, there's steady little milestones for boys and girls as they go through the school system. But for those children that you've just been talking about, the last word I would use to describe them is linear. And they're all over the place in lots of different ways. And, as you said, they come in. I'd sometimes describe those children like it's like herding wasps, because they're just, the way that they operate and the way they see the world, and it's in some ways it's so cruel to watch.
Yes.
I take them in at 11. So I'll be taking 360 new year 7s in 5 weeks' time. And there'll be a small percentage of them that I'll see come through those gates on the first day. And I know they won't be with us at Christmas. and it's heartbreaking.
Yes.
And that's, you know, because they need that therapeutic setting that you guys give them, and we can't give them, you know. But that the word linear is the last word I would use to describe those children.
Just on that, when obviously you're talking about the start of a new academic year, if you see a young person repeatedly struggling, doesn't meet the expectations of the school, or how do you decide as a senior management, as a faculty, whether that's a behavioural issue or a belonging problem? Do you work with people like James, and what does that look like to a layman?
Yeah, so for schools like us, right, so you would be surprised, and I know James will be nodding here, you would be surprised how many children get to the age of 11 without an adult filling in a form or making a referral or doing an SEN assessment. So most children in year 11 are already, most children who join me in year 7, which in the UK is 11 years old, are already on a pathway. So we just keep adding to that pathway. And we have our own, our own sort of routes that we can send children down. And I don't mean PMX, I mean like, for therapeutic schooling or, alternative provisions. What that looks like for us is, we'll get intelligence from the primary school often. We'll know a lot about them already. They'll be open to services beyond the school and schools. So whether that's children's services or, special educational needs or, the NHS. And we just keep moving that story on for the child. The real, really sort of, it's, I suppose the best way to describe it is the bureaucracy of the SEN machine. I mean, it takes forever and it just chews up children and families. And it's so slow, and it's, it's like watching a car crash in slow motion lots of the time. It's really, I don't know what it's like in NZ, but over here, it's, you feel like the machine, the bureaucracy of the machine is set up just to frustrate and sort of slow schools and families down. But I think it's probably just to do with the sheer volume of, of people coming through the system now with sort of, undiagnosed neurodiversity. I'd say lots of it isn't behaviour. You very rarely meet naughty children. Lots of it is to do with an unmet SEN need or, just to, undiagnosed neurodiversity.
What's your experience there, James?
Yeah, totally echo what Duncan has just said, really. I mean, if we view, simplifying it greatly, every type of human behaviour in one way or another is communicating some kind of need that is either met or unmet. And I totally agree with Duncan. Just all the external agencies that we ought to be able to access are often horribly stretched and poorly resourced. If we think that, legally the business of diagnosis is carried out by psychiatrists. Here in New Zealand, until recently, I think there was one psychiatrist responsible for the whole of youth intake on a particular coastal region, and this person, after nobly trying to do this job for months, just could not do it anymore. So getting proper assessments, proper diagnoses is a mission in itself. Having said that, it's I believe it's incredibly heartening how schools generally do an incredibly good job when liaison hasn't happened as well as it might, making disconnected kids to feel welcome in new schools. I'm thinking back to the time, when we transitioned from primary and intermediate into high school, called colleges here. It's a big day in anyone's life, and a word from a kind teacher was huge back then, and I think it's just as big today. Talking to disconnected kids who have fallen foul of the system, who have been excluded, suspended, stood down, or whatever. A theme that comes through particularly strongly for me is, when attendance is flagged, you might have a kid suddenly going from 80% to 30% attendance. And once that goes on, the student reports to me in a confidential setting that, well, they didn't see any point in going once they fell behind. And if we can intervene early and get teachers to recognize that and help kids sort of morph back into the system, then we don't lose them to the streets and through cracks. But yeah, getting proper diagnosis is it's a difficult job. It's an ongoing struggle, I think. Definitely here in New Zealand. My view is we're losing resources when we ought to be pouring more funding into that, for sure.
I think something that came through in the episode that we did, Duncan, the episode 5, the very first one, and you talked about poker chips with children in terms of building relationships. And you want to explain that quickly in terms of how it works in school and that positive reinforcement? And just going back to the relationship build, because I think it's so key. Obviously, we're talking about the extreme end there, but
So just to recap on that idea, Stu, it's not mine, by the way. Somebody that I'm sure you've both heard of, a gentleman called Paul Dix, talks about emotional currency in schools and how like in all relationships, we're either in deficit or credit. And when we're in credit with people, we can maybe shout at them and tell them off and give them some home truths like we have to do in school every day to children. But to be able to do that, to be able to spend with that child, I need to have money in the bank with that child. And the idea is that the poker chips theme was that, you can take poker chips away, but you've got to make sure you give more. So every child goes to bed that night with more poker chips in the pocket than they had when they got up that day. Now, it isn't just school teachers who gives, poker chips. We all do. Any adult who works with children has a responsibility. So they get on the school bus, he hasn't got the right money in his pocket or he hasn't got the right change, and the bus driver is a bit of a narc and he, rips his head off and calls him a cretin or whatever. He takes 1,000 poker chips off him. He gets into school and sees James, and, James has a great session with him, but he's used to having great sessions with James, so it was only worth 100 poker chips. So he gets to lunch, he's 900 poker chips down. Metaphor is really about every adult having a responsibility to find out what children do, each individual child, and then when you find something that they're good at, you just spend big. There was the guy whose name escapes me. I wish I could remember it. He said that in his school there was a child who was very weak academically, but they found out that he really loved using screwdrivers. So every time that he had a session with this counsellor, the counsellor would undo every plug in the room and give the kid a screwdriver, and the kid would fix all the plugs for him, thinking, oh gosh, I can really help this guy out. And it was raining poker chips for that child.
Fantastic.
It's that kind of that's a bit of a daft analogy, but, for me in a mainstream setting, when I might see, I might be on the front of the chip queue on a Friday. Chip queue is a Friday, gentlemen, in England. Anyone from England will appreciate this. And I'm on the front of the chip queue, and every child I stop the queue on, I'll have a conversation with, and the conversation will be positive, and it'll be about them, and it'll be about something that I can give them poker chips. And that intentional poker chip delivery is exhausting, though, for teachers. Some teachers will observe you doing it and say, oh, Duncan's good with kids like that. But it's not, it's deliberate. It's a deliberate action to distribute poker chips, because you never know where your next poker chip's coming from.
I think from your perspective, James, like once they obviously come into your office or your clinic at school, you talked about looking for what's underneath in episode 4. Could you talk a little bit about that? Because obviously we're trying to look for the behaviours and the thinking underneath of the pupil or the student. And doing a bit of research for this podcast, we talked about anxiety or identity and disconnection. Is that something you see in your office once they get to you?
Yeah, for sure. Once a relationship's been established, and one of the first things I have to do legally and ethically, even when I was attached to a school, now I'm a freelance and I contract to schools. Often kids haven't been told or don't understand the limits of confidentiality once they get into an office like mine. And that's the first thing I remind myself to do at the beginning of every session with every kid. And I sometimes repeat it even up to session 5 or 6, just to really tell them about the legalities around disclosure. And often kids will say things like, I might ask them, what do you understand by the notion of confidentiality? And a student might say, well, that means I can't talk about my drug use or my criminal activity with you. They might not put it quite like that. And I have to point out, look, I said the limits of most things are private in here. My privacy stops when I assess someone is at imminent and serious risk of danger to themselves, or they tell me something that leads me to believe that someone else is in serious and imminent risk. Once they understand that concept, it is amazing what kids download, honestly, and what they can communicate about the things they want to stop in their lives and the things that they want more of. For a student or a kid who's sort of functioning at a reasonably high level, they may not need too much help to identify and name feelings. But I often find a lot of students actually want a lot of help with that. I think as a teacher, I often assumed I knew what kids were feeling and that they did too, but often they don't. So the work might start with something quite basic, is to ask them, well, how are you feeling right now? Often kids will say, well, I don't know, or I feel nothing. So there's a lot of psychoed goes into helping them name feelings, helping them lean into feelings, helping them to understand and realize that no feeling or thought is in and of itself bad. We all experience anxiety at some point. We all experience pain, fear, lack of confidence, joy, sadness, happiness, hurt. And so I think trust is built up slowly and carefully with those parameters. What I've experienced is if you tell a student that what they can talk about is confidential, if you break that trust, you lose them. That's it. Once they've gone forever. And regaining trust is an incredibly hard job. I'm not sure, Dunk, at the moment legally at a school with your size, how many counsellors do you have to service what is obviously a big load? In New Zealand schools, I think the NZEC, the New Zealand Association of Counsellors, recommends one counsellor per 400 kids. And a lot of schools that is just not financially viable. What's the legal requirement in England at the moment about therapeutic services for kids?
So it's the two tiers are the tiers provided by the NHS, which is in the UK is called CAMS.
CAMS, right?
Which is they would only really touch the sort of more high needs with complex cases. Within school settings, the government rolled out in the post-COVID era, they rolled out a a system whereby schools that were deemed necessary, believe this, James. So not every school was, if it depended on your economic sort of background of the majority of the children, whether you would get one. So lots of schools didn't get one. Lots of the counselling that's provided in schools that I'm aware of, and certainly in our trust, is provided by pastoral teams, and they would not be qualified to the level that someone like you is. They would have no real formal, therapeutic qualifications. It would be more of a pastoral touchdown and a check-in. We have in our school, we have one member of staff who is not anywhere near your level of competency for 1,700 students. The local CAMS is flat out wait lists. You're talking 12 months waiting lists. Yeah. I mean, it's a really seriously bad setup at the moment.
Yeah,
and the need's getting bigger and bigger every year.
What would you say is the root cause of that, James, from people that come through your clinic, especially in the secondary school space? I think something you and I have spoke about, and I'm not sure whether young people would be capable in this space from the EQ side of things that comes through a lot of the podcasts is, self-awareness, emotional regulation, communication, and all those pieces we take for granted, whether a young person firstly understands what that is, and then secondly has the tools in the box to deal with it. Like, what do you see coming through your office?
Well, an incredible variety. It would be pretty easy, actually, to get depressed, about the state of behaviour among young people. On the other side of it was, I found, particularly working with boys at age 11 to 19, how incredibly attuned boys are with their feelings. They might need a bit of help to identify what feelings are and what they're for. But it can be incredibly heartening to see that, a kid growing in confidence, being attuned with what's going on in their internal world, and how they suddenly start to link, God, I don't know why I feel depressed. And suddenly recognizing, this depression has been hanging around since a beloved uncle or grandfather died. That's incredibly heartening. And again, just to back up what Duncan said, that there are some amazing teachers in schools who do an incredible job despite stretched resources of mentoring, guiding, tutoring kids. Going back to what one of the previous questions about the poker chips, a classroom I saw fairly recently. I mean, when I was a school counsellor, I instinctively knew which classrooms were safer than others. I knew when to get a kid out of a classroom for his appointment he'd forgotten. Some classrooms I avoided because I knew that student might be ridiculed if it was made public. I witnessed a classroom fairly recently where this teacher had set up a kind of yellow pages of expertise within the classroom. It was a low-grade class, and a lot of these kids didn't think they were good at anything. This teacher had, I believe, started with a series of non-negotiables to establish a kind of classroom culture, and had then got the kids to buy into making their own classroom code of conduct. And from that grew this kind of cultural ethos where even the kids who felt they weren't good at anything, they knew they could go to Kid X, who was good at IT, Kid Y, who was a good listener. And it was an incredibly safe environment. And I saw previously disenfranchised kids kind of reconnecting all of a sudden. They were having fun, they felt safe. And I think if you can meet those two sets of criteria, if the kid feels safe and they're having fun, then they really start to learn. So it would be easy to get sort of depressed and pessimistic about, the state of young people and what they get up to. It's also important to see that, the vast majority of kids do okay. And that's thanks to a lot of hard work that schools do, despite the economic constraints. I mean, I'm thinking about your one pastoral teacher in your school, Duncan, who's kind of has pastoral responsibility maybe for up to 1,700 kids. I'm not saying they'd see every kid pastorally, but that's a huge load.
Yeah, I mean, that would be for specialist mental health support. But within that, obviously, there's many staff who offer that low level, so dealing with anxiety, and sort of the lower end of depression. Lots of pastoral staff, who might be teaching 33 periods of history over a 2-week period, would also pick up, and it's that's the human side of why people want to teach, James.
Yes,
this idea of, the noble, wanting the best for young people. It's just incredibly, I just find it incredibly frustrating in the English system at the moment. The amount of hats that teachers have to wear. It's incredible. I mean, it was interesting what you were saying then regarding, trust and belonging, and this idea of safety that we've touched on. And Stu, you started off by asking, how do you get compliance from children and also develop belonging? I think you did anyway. I thought that's what you were aiming at as well. When we talk, but compliance and belonging are two very different things. I mean, James just alluded to that just then. You can have a perfectly silent class, 30 kids, all on the, on the face of it being absolutely compliant, but are sat there in total anxiety because they're scared of the teacher and they don't want to get into trouble. And, he'll shout and I think, when what James was alluding to there, which, speaking about children at a different end of the behaviour spectrum, but it's true for all children, I think, is when you get that psychological safety in the classroom, then, these children that are quiet or these children that are on the face of it difficult to manage, are willing to contribute, ask questions, make mistakes, seek help, trust adults. And, to get that balance in the classroom as a teacher that's when, in my opinion, I mean, I do, as I've alluded to before, I lecture new teachers coming into the profession on behaviour management. And, I always think that the key to behaviour management is not to have children scared of you, but it's to have them scared to let you down. And there's a massive difference between that, though, because one is based on fear, and in my eyes, one is based on trust. And when you get that trust, those children, whether they be the most difficult or complex kids in the year group or a goody two shoes called Stu Savage from the St. Helens, you'll move mountains with those children.
I don't think I was ever that child, Dunk.
I don't know, Stu. I don't know.
Something that came to mind when the reason I mentioned the emotional currency and the poker chips, and something we spoke about before, Duncan, it also permeates through what I see in business. There's a chain of shops here, Bunnings, which is very much like B&Q in the UK. And they sort of have this customer policy about these touch points and moments of the customer, the journey of the customer coming into the store. And that's very much like, I feel like a student or a pupil coming into the gates of the school. And you spoke about, meeting them at the gate and the experience on Chip Friday and the classroom and what that all looks like. I guess what I'm alluding to is those moments, those touch points of a child are really important throughout the school before they even need support from people like James. And is that something you're well aware of within your school, Dunk?
Yeah, look, what we don't do is we don't profile children. but we kind of do, because, you know, when someone like myself, and when I say someone like myself, I'm talking as a classroom teacher now, as well as being a senior leader. But as when you're in your classroom, you're constantly just triaging children, aren't you? You know, and you know we have an expression in English, the English education system at the moment, which is what's good for children with educational need is good for all children. So if you teach everybody as if they have a special educational need, they're going to get some quality teaching, because the the teaching tactics that you might use, like scaffolding and, you know, sort of intentional pathways and all these sort of buzz phrases that we use, um, actually benefit everybody. So there's certain things that we do around the school, and, you know, children will just think Mr. Morrison's just being nice to me, or he's, you know, he's checking in with me. But obviously what we're doing is, because we've been involved in education for so long, you're actually just triaging children all the time. So when you speak to them, if something doesn't seem right or something's off kilter, you're thinking, oh, right, I'll speak to this adult, or I'll maybe call home, or maybe I'll touch in with his form tutor, or maybe I'll speak to his head, you know, and you're just doing that all the time. So that's something that educational professionals, whether they be teachers or otherwise, are always on in the school environment, Stu.
Well, you only have so much sway, I guess, in terms of the environment and it being effective or successful. And obviously, we can only do so much training and have so much input into the success of the students within that classroom. How much is reliant on other things that may be outside of your control, like the home environment?
Yeah, look, I mean, I suppose so. In the hour that you're with that class, you know, you've got a list of activities and key messages that you need to land. You know, what you're probably not continually asking yourself is, what's wrong with this child? What's this child's behaviour telling me right now? I suppose you're also not thinking about, you know, is there some kind of trauma informed practice I need to be referring to here whilst delivering a session on, you know, elevation, shall we say? I think what schools expect teachers to do is to teach well, and then the pastoral system that runs alongside the curriculum should be there for sort of the other side of school life that is to do with trauma, is to do with what's wrong with this child. Is there something I need to know? What's this behaviour telling us? And I suppose we are reliant on how well those two sides of the school talk to each other. Now, in English, the English education system, schools are set up on two clear pathways, and James will know this. You know, you have your pastoral side, which involves well-being, you know, relationships with home and communication with home, and behaviour to a T. Not all of behaviour, though, because obviously we can't remove behaviour from the classroom teacher, because that's a big part of their job. And then alongside that's the curriculum. So it's how well those two sides of the school talk to each other. And every school will have their own bespoke systems that are there to capture that information. And to, you know, James referred to, you know, those children when they fall through the nets. I suppose that would be the way, because there's so much pressure on teachers to teach now, and to teach well, you know.
Is that something that we talked about Ofsted in the last episode too? And belonging, is that a top-down thing from Ofsted that schools need to do alongside obviously teaching in the classroom? Or is that something that you've picked up as a senior, as the board of the school, the principal and senior management, and you're trying to invest it yourself?
Yeah, so I think the reason why belonging is such a buzzword, and, you know, we did touch upon this in the last session, we spoke about the importance of it. You know, nowhere, you don't get a grading from Ofsted on belonging. And that's because belonging is evident in every other strand. So anything else that you're going to measure, any school metric, tells the story of belonging in that school. James talked about attendance about half an hour ago, belonging.
Yeah.
Outcomes for children, belonging. The feel you get when you walk into a classroom, belonging. The corridor, the canteen, the yard, your bullying figures, your racial instances, all of those things that we do have to present, your safeguarding logs, your counselling work, your exclusion data, your suspension data, all of that stuff has just got the golden thread of belonging through it. And I suppose without trying to make it too obvious, the importance of inclusion in belonging is huge as well. And the new Ofsted framework is all about inclusion.
I think you spoke about inclusion and widening access last time, and you've kind of read my mind. Like the next question was going to be, how do we measure success in this space? And I think last time you spoke about belonging having an impact on attendance and behaviour and attainment and punctuality and all those good things. And is that how you're measured as a school?
Yeah, I mean, don't forget, Stu, we started off talking about the rules of the game, didn't we? And belonging is how well you can interpret the rules of the game. That's how you measure your success. If we were just talking about your love of cricket before, Stu, we started recording. So how well you do at cricket, is how well you know the rules of the game, but not just the rules of the game that are written down, the nuanced rules of the game that everyone accepts, and but they aren't necessarily written down. They know how to play the game. It doesn't. It's like in rugby league. We've got a shared history of rugby league. Yourself and me, and we go back a long way in rugby league terms. And there's certain things that you would do and wouldn't do on the pitch, and in the clubhouse afterwards, and they're not written down. If someone gave you the slap on the rugby pitch in the game, you wouldn't then go and finish it in the bar afterwards. You wouldn't do that in rugby league. It's not written down anywhere, though. It's how well you can access those rules, whether they're obvious rules.
Happens more in cricket, that, doesn't it? Settling it outside.
Well, yeah, that sounds more like football and cricket, if I'm being honest. But yeah, so it's how well you access
this is Doug's identity. Doug's identity's coming through. I think he may have to sit down with you, James.
No, James, let's say we'll have another call in a bit, James. We'll have a private call.
Just think in terms of just concluding this session and the podcast, like it's been absolutely brilliant, obviously, to listen to both of your perspectives. And we talked about like attendance and behaviour and attainment there. If we move this on 12 months or you had a magic wand, like what would you want to see in and around schools and education related back to belonging? How would you move this on? And what would it look like if it was successful and effective?
If I can just, something James said in the first couple of minutes, which really I found really interesting, was this idea that how some of the children that he deals with say that they can't cope with the difference in different teachers' classrooms. And I've never thought of it that way before, James. So that's something I'm going to take away from this, because, that's something that could have a huge impact on individuals' lives in school. And it's something that I've never thought of before, that variation in the classroom. And it doesn't have to be negative. It's just, I suppose, the unpredictability of it for certain young people will make them feel less safe. So
that is really interesting. And often, seeing kids in schools who would volunteer to come in for a session with me, you soon realised a student presenting would say, well, I need to see you Monday period 2 and Thursday period 4 and Friday period 1. You look at the timetable and it's maths or history, or you realise they're dodging a certain classroom, and you allow a bit of that to begin with, but obviously you can't have a kid missing maths for a complete year. What's always interesting to me is asking kids to identify, well, why don't you like maths, or why don't you like English? Well, so-and-so doesn't like me. Mr. Jones hates me, Miss Smith hates me. And you could encourage that narrative, but I'm always interested in hearing from kids, well, what makes Mr. or Mrs. Brown a teacher you like? And there seems to be current themes that are ongoing, and kids say, well, they make me feel wanted. I trust them. And when I explore that further, I say, well, how do they do that? And it's the simplest of strategies. Well, I know what the rules are. I know what the expectations are. Or they gave us a chance to contribute to the classroom code. But also how kids would describe very, very simple activities that were conducted right at the beginning of a term or a year. Activities based on, say, cooperative learning. I mean, in my day in England, it was called student-centred learning, with tomorrow's schools over here from the year 2000, I believe, when cooperative learning was pushed. A teacher who could organise group learning and not letting kids select the initial groups, because the popular kids would group together, and those kind of kids who came from schools where they didn't have any friends were left isolated. They were the kids who were flagging up, well, that teacher obviously didn't like me. So it wasn't, sort of earth-shattering strategies that these kids report. It's saying, well, this teacher helped me to feel I belong to the classroom. They didn't single me out. And as you said, Duncan, earlier, yeah, they didn't frighten me. They didn't assume that my silence meant I agree with your rules. So simple strategies is that, make sure every kid belongs to a group. And I remember a kid describing to me his favourite classroom where, and not every kid likes group work all the time, but the teacher would select groups using a pack of cards, for example. All knaves get together, all kings, all aces over here. And that provoked some initial anxiety. Kids were moved out of their comfort zones, but suddenly new friendships were made. I found that to be an incredibly consistent thread. Whereas, the teacher who might seem that they've got a very compliant classroom always had teacher-led seating plan and the classrooms were silent. Kids might be able to parrot dates and formula, but they had no idea what they meant. It's a memory from my own education many years ago. I can still parrot the scientific formula S equals UT plus half AT squared, but I couldn't tell you what it means. I had no idea. I had no idea how I could apply that. So I don't know. I don't know whether that adds to the conversation or takes away from it. But it needn't be complex, I think, for a teacher or a school to get kids included.
I mean, I would agree with that, James. And I think going back to where I started off, I think when we said about those three things that children think when they come through the gate, that they matter, they're safe, and they're going to succeed in this building. I would agree with you, James, in so much as the strategies that worked when you were at school would work today, because it ain't that complicated, belonging. I think we spend a lot of time on curriculum design, and I think Stu talked about, in the last podcast, how much money people don't spend on belonging because, it's a bit hard to pin down and you can't prove how powerful it's been and the impact of spend. But actually, in educational terms, we spend years and years reinventing the wheel when it comes to different pedagogies about how to teach. You mentioned two really quickly then, but actually the real guiding principles still matter more, which is that an adult can make a child feel safe, secure, and important in a room.
Yeah.
And that's the same as it was, 50 years ago? 40
Absolutely.
years ago.
Yeah. Totally agree with that.
I think it keeps coming back to this theme, this trend in organisational culture and the culture room. You start to see all these patterns, and it very much it comes back to the way we think and behave as human beings. And you said there it's not changed in 50 years. I'd probably argue longer. You know, we all want to feel safe. We all want to feel like somebody cares about us and we're part of something bigger than ourselves, and we feel important. You start to see all these words come up all the time that sit under belonging. And I don't think it's changed in a long period. In this country, Duncan, you're probably not aware, but we've got an election coming up, a general election in November, and the education minister seems very focused on proving metrics and rushing through reform and very much about literacy and numeracy. What that does is it kind of splits camps, as it normally does in the political spectrum. And on the right, they're very much about achievements and measurements and metrics. And on the left, obviously, it's a bit more about belonging and well-being and the things we've touched on today. And I think there's a huge amount of gold in what we've discussed and what sits under belonging. And obviously, we could do a whole other podcast on that. I'm not sure, being a POM, James, living in New Zealand, whether you see and feel the same things.
Yeah, I often think back to my teaching days are behind me, but having done 5 or 6 years in the UK, what I remember, the joy of teaching when I started out was you could spend most of your time preparing lessons. I'm not sure whether that's true these days. You know, paperwork, testing and standards seem to take over. And I think that's to the detriment of the young people we're trying to educate. You know, what I remember from my school days many years ago were teachers who had this kind of incredible passion for their subject and who were free to teach it, but who were also sort of kind and loving as well. Yeah, I think more and more politics and testing are taking away that joy. I remember being sad to admit to myself and to realise that neither of my kids were remotely interested in going into education. And I remember feeling pleased about that, which was disturbing, because that's a cynical part of me. Well, if you go into teaching now, you're in for a rough ride. But remembering also, when it goes well, teaching ought to be, for me, still one of the greatest jobs in the world. So rewarding, you know, when you get kids on your side and you can pull them around. I think it still ought to be an amazing job, and I think governments just ought to keep their beaks out of it.
Well,
yeah,
is that how you feel in the UK, Dunk?
Yeah, look, I mean, I started teaching about 22 years ago, and I always, in recent years, I've reflected on teaching as a job was more fun 20 odd years ago. And schools were a lot more fun. But conversely, I would also say that the results that we get now for some of our more disadvantaged students, or students who necessarily would have fell through the cracks 22 years ago, are better now. So I think that sometimes I have to give my head a bit of a wobble, because I have to maybe reflect on that. It might not be about me, Stu, and how much fun I had. And school is a results business. I hate to say it, but it is, because if we get it wrong, then the life chances of these children can be seriously curtailed. However, that being said, it is an art, teaching, and you can't measure art, can you, Stu? Like cricket, Stu.
I think the next podcast ought to be about cricket.
Yeah. And I think on that note, given it's after 11 and you're itching to get away for the cricket highlights, and James is in clinic and is starting his work day here, It's been a pleasure, fellas, and education and the insights and knowledge you've shared have been invaluable. Thank you for your time and your energy. We really appreciate having you on the Culture 360 podcast once again. And we look forward to maybe having you on in the future. Thank you for your time. And
thank you, Stu.
Have a great day.
Thanks,
Great,
James.
Very, very good to meet you, Duncan.
You too, James. Have a lovely day, sir.
Okay, mate. Take care.
Take care.
If you enjoyed the Culture 360 podcast, and like me, you geek out on leadership and organisational culture, then please smash a like, subscribe, and share the podcast. Also, if you have any feedback or ideas, or you'd like to get in touch, then please connect with the Culture Room at thecultureroom.co.nz or on our various social media platforms. Thanks for listening.